and welcome to Adult Music, the podcast with music for the mature mind. This is episode 182. I'm your co-host, Russ.
And I'm your co-host, Mike.
We're getting to the end of summer here, Mike.
Yeah, we are. In fact, we are at the end of summer. Today is the equinox, equal night and day, and the equinox.
Days are getting shorter, although the heat has been continuing in Japan. That should come to an end as we get into the fall season. And there's a lot of releases coming out to talk about new music. This week, as always, we're going to have 6 new releases, 3 in classical and 3 in jazz to share with you.
Yeah, and I've got some unusual classical stuff coming up in the future. You know, it looks like there aren't any major new releases in classical music, but there are a lot of really kind of second-tier ones, you know, which is always my favorite. I really like those the best because they're usually pretty surprising.
The fall looks pretty stacked for major jazz releases. So a lot of them I'd like to talk about, but I want to balance them out with a little bit more obscure or harder to find releases. So next week, we're actually going to get back to some Greek jazz.
Oh, cool. That's the next best thing to being in Greece, listening to Greek jazz. You're almost there when you're doing that. Almost. Yeah.
Get those Mediterranean vibes going.
Yeah.
Anyway, before we get into tonight's program, I want to remind everyone that in the episode description, you find links to Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music for all of the music that we'll discuss. And at the top of the description, there's a link to the full episode playlist. That's all the music in one place on Deezer, CD quality streaming music from France. You can listen to the podcast on Deezer as well if you want to get everything in one place. If you can't see the full description or the recording list and links are not easy to follow on whatever app you listen to us on, you can always come over and check us out on our host site. That's Podbean, PODBEAN.com, where everything is easy to follow. If you enjoy the podcast, please follow or subscribe wherever you listen to us. Tell a music-loving friend, tell a musician, help us grow our audience. If you take a moment to give us a ranking or write a short review, that also helps us get listed in the podcast and music category recommendations, another way that we can increase our audience. Also, do come over and follow us on our Facebook page. You can get extra info and more new releases throughout the week. I put up a bunch this week as well. Mike even posted some classical stuff up there.
Yeah, I got off my butt. I was kind of doing the looking for new releases. I just said, oh, why don't I just put these up because they're all pretty interesting. And in fact, 3 of the ones I put up we're going to do next week because they're all new releases. So
you can leave a message or comment there as well. See our interaction with the record labels and artists. And if you'd like to contact us directly with any comments or questions, you can get in touch by email. We'd love to hear from you. Our email address is adultmusicpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. We're going to play music samples, and we're in stereo now.
Yes, we are.
This is our fair use disclaimer. The music sample clips we play are for commentary and educational purposes. We recommend that listeners listen to the complete recordings, all of which are available on streaming services in the links provided. And we also suggest that if you enjoy the music, you consider purchasing the CDs or high-quality downloads to support the artists.
Yeah, I just want to say that, you know, we're in stereo now. We're sort of like, I think it's a Japan thing. We're like the director Yasujiro Ozu, you know, who refused to use color until he was forced to in the late 50s when every other Japanese director was already using color. He was just kind of complaining, oh, black and white is better. But, you know, audiences wanted color. So here we are. Oh, finally in stereo, like we've just... split the atom or something.
Yeah,
like way behind everybody else.
Anyway, what are we going to do launch into the classical music tonight, Mike?
All right, so the first album is really from between the Baroque and classical era, or really the early classical era, I guess. This is one of our favorite composers, Philipp Emanuel Bach.
Yeah. And
a composer by the name of Antonín Kraft, whose name I had never heard before. This is a new name for me, yeah. For both of us, as it turns out. And these are cello concertos by those composers. Now, I've heard several cello concertos from Philipp Emanuel Bach, including this one before. But Antonín Kraft, don't know anything about him. Let's find out. This is by the cellist Jean-Guihen Queyras and Ensemble Resonanz conducted by Riccardo Minasi. And I have several recordings that this ensemble has done, and they do period instruments. They don't use vibrato. And they use really fast tempos always. It's just something I've noticed. And this is true on this album as well. So I have other symphonic recordings by them. Depends on what you're looking for, I guess. But anyway, this is on the Harmonia Mundi label, released on August 30th. So the booklet note, written by Peter Walney, makes a point that these two works were composed 50 years apart from each other. Now, I'm about to turn 59 years old, so that's basically the span of my lifetime. It's a little less, all right? But during those 50 years, enormous change happened, and I think we could say the same for our lives as well. When we were born, there were no computers, or none in the house, and now you really can't live without them. You're carrying them around with you. And the lives we used to live, we almost can't live them anymore.
Yep.
Because we always have to be online. The period, though, in the 18th century was referred to by historians as the Age of Enlightenment and Revolution. In 1751, the first volume of the Encyclopedia, edited by Denis Diderot and Jean-Baptiste Le Rond d'Alembert, was published in Paris and became really the mouthpiece of the Enlightenment. This is the first time anyone had ever tried to collect all human knowledge and put it in one series of books. And now we have Wikipedia trying to do that. How far we've come. Anyway, in 1804, the end of that period, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, thereby staking his claim to reshape Europe. And music also underwent rapid development during those 5 decades. And though the musical period is thought of as the classical period, the historical conditions under which the two composers created their works were actually more divisive than unifying. This is usually the case. Historians will create like a period and say, oh, this is the period that this happened. And yet everybody's really competing against each other to kind of get their sort of ideas out there. Okay, let's go to the first piece then. Antonín Kraft Cello Concerto in C major, Opus 4. This is the later of the two cello concerti. This one is composed in 1804. Now you want to think 1803 is the year Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, appeared, and that really changed music. Now, we have to keep in mind when we say things like this is also a way to understand history. When somebody does something revolutionary and that changes the direction of music, it doesn't mean that music just immediately changes. It just means somebody has just laid the groundwork, and then other people have to sort of realize it, and put it into practice. And it really took 20 years for people to start doing that. Really, the Romantic period were the ones who really picked up on Beethoven's style.
When I heard this, I wasn't thinking of Beethoven at all.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like a much earlier work, but it didn't sound like an earlier work then. It just sounded like a normal work, and Beethoven was really ahead. But he didn't have to be. He could have been crazy. People could have decided that Beethoven's music was really off the wall, but the Romantics heard it for what it was worth, and they wound up making it like central to music history, really, and European music history. I
was in the mind of Haydn right from the beginning of this.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, Haydn was still alive at the time. Haydn died in 1809, I think. Oh, no, 1808. He died before the Fifth Symphony, because I remember Robert Greenberg mentioning that if Haydn hadn't died before the Fifth Symphony by Beethoven came out, hearing that probably would have killed him. Because that's a really revolutionary work. We think of it as kind of cute now, but it's really special. Anyway, Kraft was born in the small town of, I don't know how to say this, Rokycany in western Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic. He studied at the University of Prague and took lessons on the cello, I guess, from Franz Josef Werner, a cellist in the orchestra of the city's Kreuzherren Church. He moved to Vienna, where his talent as a cellist got him the position of principal cellist in the court orchestra of Prince Nikolaus I, Joseph Esterházy, a familiar name if you know your Haydn history. And he worked under the direction of Kapellmeister Joseph Haydn. He was a cellist in Haydn's orchestra. Kraft also took composition lessons from Haydn, which they paid off, I can tell you. He sounds a lot like Haydn. Haydn's cello concerto in D major was written for him, as was the solo cello part in Beethoven's Triple Concerto, Opus 56. He also played the cello line in Mozart's late Divertimento for string trio in E-flat major, K563, a piece that just doesn't get recorded enough. I really love it, and I'd like to hear a new recording of that. And he also played the cello in the premieres of Beethoven's early string quartets. He only published a small number of his own compositions, and in this concerto, Haydn's influence is very obvious, as Russ has mentioned. In the work, Kraft fitted an extraordinarily exacting solo part into the pleasing traditional scheme of the classical concerto form. All 3 movements include catchy, sometimes folk-like themes. This is kind of like, writing a generic play about a love story, except that you give yourself these really profound, philosophical, amazing dialogues, where everybody else has to say, gee, boss. It doesn't come across like that, though. But the cello part is really the main focus here. All right, so let's get into this. The first movement, Allegro aperto. The opening starts with a martial timpani roll, a bit reminiscent of Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. The Jupiter Symphony was earlier than this, actually. The tempo on this is really fast and rather exciting, as is often the case with this ensemble and Minasi's conducting, as I've mentioned. The second theme softens and is taken sensitively, but still at speed. Minasi is driving the music hard, but does get some electricity out of it, and the cello enters at 1 minute and 40 seconds. So I'm going to sample the cello's entry, because that's really what we want to hear. Notice the fast tempo. Now, this is impressive because the cellist is already playing a difficult part. Now he has to play it at a very fast speed. But this is typical of the Ensemble Resonanz. They really get these fast tempi. So I want you to notice that as well as the cello playing. Let's hear it. You heard at the beginning all the double stops followed by the sweet melody. There's no vibrato on the tone, either from the cello or the orchestra, which is surprising from Queyras as a cellist. This is a period-style performance. Queyras blends in with the orchestra as a result, especially when the sensitive second theme is back at around the 3rd minute. There's some absolutely spectacular Philippe bowing on a double-stopped section at the 3 minute and 35 second mark, and I guess I should have us sample this too. I'm getting us out of there. He hit that cadence twice, but never stopped. The line just keeps going. Also, you notice that very, very fast bowing on the double-stopped chords is pretty impressive. And it's almost a guitar effect, sort of a Spanish guitar accompaniment. Really amazing. In the composition, Antonín Kraft rather cleverly avoids the cadence, ending the cello solo's exposition for an entire minute before finally having him land on it. And that's why I got out early. We would have been sampling that for a whole minute. At 5 minutes and 7 seconds, we're into the more exploratory development section, with the cello riffing on the second sensitive theme at the beginning. In the 6th minute, the orchestra explodes with powerful chords, sending the cello on a solo section filled with figuration. At 7 minutes, we hear the recapitulation played in the cello in an upper register with a rather unique tone. So this is really the recapitulation, the opening theme, except that it's got a different tone. Let's hear it. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that's some impressive playing. That is not the end of the movement, by the way. The second theme starts right after that, and at the 8 minute and 17 second mark, after an explosive, aggressive set of accented chords from the orchestra, the cello goes into its highly melodic cadenza, which is very short. The second section is very pretty, Queyras conjuring some light, almost harmonic-sounding tones out of the cello, but they're not harmonics. They're just kind of a sort of veiled bowing tone that he can do. Queyras shows some impressive virtuosity as the movement races to its end. There's a brief teasing slowing at about the 10th minute. Then it's a sprint to the finish, which I have to admit is exciting. The second movement is labeled Romance, Andante. It starts with a royal fanfare from the orchestra. The cello comes in with a gauzy tone to play the melodic theme. Let's hear the opening. I noticed that we haven't even heard the melody played straight through, and yet Kraft is already decorating the melodic line in the cello. I don't think that's Queyras adding any notes there. The theme lasts until 1 minute and 50 seconds, where there's a cadence. After this, the movement goes off into an almost operatic recitative type section, with chord, accents, and melodic cello line. It changes the song-like nature of the opening section. At 3 minutes and 14 seconds, the opening melody is back, blending with the smooth-sounding brass in a lovely moment. The brass figure accompanies the cello's theme right up to the end. Track 3, Rondo alla Cossacca, or like a Cossack theme rondo. Cossack would be a Russian peasant, I guess. Moderato. This starts in a charming rustic fashion, and here the tempo doesn't sound pushed at all. There's a measured dance quality to the theme. The cello comes in afterwards with a B section for the theme, which features a lot of figuration, again impressively played by Queyras. Let's hear the charming theme as it's repeated by the cello after the, shall we say, middle 8? I don't know, the departure from the main theme. It comes back, and I'm going to play it from about 1 minute and 10 seconds. Okay, there's a cadence I'm getting out. A winding cello line brings us back to the rondo theme in the second minute. The movement has a lot of charm, especially with the tempo and phrasing used here. The movement's rustic quality comes through clearly and appealingly. There's a gorgeous cello theme beginning at about the 3 minute and 10 second mark when it departs again from the rondo theme, ending again in figuration. Now I really liked this theme, and I'm going to sample this as well. And there's the impressive figuration that ends that theme. At 5 minutes and 34 seconds, the rondo theme comes back in a triplet rhythm, bringing the lift to its step still higher. The way it's taken here further uplifted me. It's a really wonderfully paced movement, as well as a wonderfully performed movement, especially by the cellist. Toward the end, we get recitative-like chords again from the orchestra as the cello searches for a cadence. It engages in rapid figuration and finds its way there by the end. It's a charming movement, well interpreted here. Highly recommended that listeners sample the entire movement and really the entire piece. It's good for your whole body energy balance to hear the whole piece because it's fast, slow, fast. It's good for the soul. Tracks 4 through 6, one of our favorite composers, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, cello concerto in B flat major, H436, and I remember WQ is Oquin 17 number 1. This is from 1751, so this is the earlier work by 50 years almost. CPE Bach was, of course, J.S. Bach's second son. We've mentioned this a few times. This work comes from CPE's Berlin period. The piece is innovative in that the cello part is integrated into a densely woven texture and invested with an overriding arch of musical tension. Now, things like this are important because, Mozart picked up on things like this too, the solo instrument blending with the orchestra yet still being heard. It's not merely virtuosic, as were many of his contemporaries' concertos, so this concerto really stands out in its era. And Mozart wasn't even born when this was written, so you can keep that in mind. Track 4 is the first movement, Allegretto. The orchestra comes in with an elegant opening melody, played at a slightly fast tempo, but at a speed where the elegance remains. There's a cheekily taken false cadence at the 45-second mark. Oh boy, there are a lot of these in this movement, and really in the piece. It's one of the reasons we love CPE Bach so much. He's really clever with his interrupted cadences. The cello enters at the 57-second marks after the cadence, and its entry is barely perceptible. It blends so completely with the orchestra. Let's hear this. I'm going to play it from a little earlier part around the 52nd mark, and you'll hear the cello gradually make itself known. Now you'll notice in this fairly fast-paced first movement that we're not hearing the cello do the virtuosic things it did in the Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk, weren't they a German electronic band? Anyway, we're talking about Antonín Kraft's work here. Here the cello's theme is song-like and melodic. He also has the false cadence, in fact more than one, at about the 2-minute and 18-second mark. The opening material repeats after the cello solo, but this is the development section. Keys suddenly begin changing, and we get into deep harmonic relationships, so there's a little sleight of hand on CPE's part here, and the ensemble put the trick across well. The cello engages in quite a bit of figuration in this section. At the 4-minute and 55-second mark, we're at the recapitulation, which the orchestra plays. It's a bit abbreviated so that the cello can come back in with its theme. It sounds like there's some key rebalancing in the cello's line, as it dips into some harmonies outside the main theme. At the 6-minute and 7-second mark, we get some harmonic surprises, but the cello gets back on track toward the cadence. There are plenty of further opportunities for the cellist to display his skill in figuration towards the end, and Queyras puts it all across effortlessly and elegantly. The movement has a pleasant interpretation, keeping all of the musical wit noticeable. Track 5, the second movement, Adagio. This is the slow movement of this fast, slow, fast structure. This has a minor sound in the orchestra, a minor key sound in this dark opening. It's surprisingly dark for its period. Minasi puts the feeling across well, choosing a suitable tempo. This goes generally at the speed it normally does. The pianissimi are just that, very quiet. CPE can't resist a wink at the audience, and therefore there's a false cadence at about the 1-minute and 20-second mark. The cello enters with a veiled tone at 1 minute and 27 seconds. I'm going to go back and we'll hear that false cadence, but we're not really going to hear the setup, so it's not going to have its effect. But let's try it anyway. Some interesting timbres from Queyras in this movement. He keeps that veiled tone, but varies it quite a bit as the movement goes on. It's haunting and effective. There's another very attractive false cadence at 2 minutes and 52 seconds, with the full cadence at 3 minutes and 6 seconds. The orchestra comes in alone for this, setting up the cello for new but still melodic material, reaching into new keys. At about 4 minutes and 20 seconds, both cello and orchestra achieve an impressive hushed tone, with the cello veiled once again. Queyras breaks out of that for a more full-toned section that follows. At 5 minutes and 12 seconds, the cello's opening melody is repeated, this time with some ornamentation, and Queyras is back to that veiled tone. The orchestra occasionally jumps out of corners with scare chords, like this is taking place in a haunted house, but the cello goes its lonely way to the final cadence. I really think CPE was trying to startle his audience with those sudden fortissimi. This is also something Haydn used to do. He used to know who his audience was. And there's a symphony called the Surprise Symphony, just to get off track, by Haydn. And there were these people in his audience. They used to be the same people every week because they were at the Esterhazy's employ, part of the family. And these same people would fall asleep every week, and he put this really loud chord in the middle of this work just so that he would startle them out of their sleep. And he was like looking from behind the curtain, or maybe behind his back if he was conducting, to see the effect that would have. Yeah, music was fun. Anyway, track 6, the last movement, Allegro Assai. This has a quick ebullient tempo from the orchestra. The second phrase has some pauses built into it, but then the orchestra starts flowing quickly to the end of its theme. Once again, we get an interrupted cadence extending the ending. The cello comes in at the 57-second mark with a quiet theme that the orchestra tries to jolt it out of. Let's hear this. And some impressive playing there. It's like the orchestra is a bunch of children trying to push a tired parent into a game. The cello does wake up with some quick figuration, which you heard at the end there. At 2 minutes and 35 seconds, the cadence is reached via a swerving harmony, very clever. The cello then goes off into a solo development section with light orchestral accompaniment. When the orchestra comes in full force, it redirects the harmony towards the opening and seems to have reached a recapitulation in the 3rd minute. The cello gets a solo section that's completely at odds with the orchestra in energy and tone. At 4 minutes and 25 seconds, there's a cadenza, more characterful than virtuosic. It's got a lonely, what am I going to do with these kids feel to it. Let's hear a bit of that. When the orchestra comes in, the cello slowly begins cooperating and going with the ebullient mood. High spirits are, of course, restored for the material that leads to the final cadence. And that's the end of the album. It's pretty short, with 2 classical concertos and no other works. The Kraft work, I keep saying that, it sounds like the Trans-Europe Express guys, I don't know. The work by Antonín Kraft is highly virtuosic, and Queyras shines in it. The first movement is pushed hard, but not to the point where it starts irritating the listener. Minasi does get excitement out of the music with this approach. Interestingly, as the program goes on, tempos start to settle into something more conventional, though always on the energetic side. The playing itself never sounds conventional and is always just a bit on edge. Both orchestra and soloist play without vibrato, as is the current practice in period instrument performance. But I have to say, I'd like to hear a bit of vibrato in these works and others of the period. I particularly liked the third movement of the Antonín Kraft concerto for its highly appealing folk-like themes and sudden settling of the tempo into an ideal dancing groove. I thought the CPE Bach concerto was extremely well played, both by Queyras and Ensemble Resonanz. The music maintains its elegance in the first movement, and Minasi is adept at bringing out CPE Bach's sense of humor, as is Queyras. The second and third movements both leave a characterful impression behind, the second with its haunted, muted quality, particularly evident in Queyras' tone, and the third with its contrasting tempos and harmony between the soloist and orchestra. It's a performance full of life that I really enjoyed. I want to say, though, I think an entire additional concerto could have fit onto the album. But this is a satisfying program as it is, and the performances, as long as you like period practice, are exemplary and leave an impression that makes me want to go back and hear it again, and that's among the best things you could want from a recording.
I was impressed with the performances here, especially the enthusiastic performance of the Kraft, which was new to me. As I mentioned from the opening, the Haydn influence is apparent. And rather than originality, this work impresses with, here's that word again, fine craft. And pleasing contrast highlighted by the performance, especially in the challenging tempos. In contrast, you notice the quirkiness of CPE Bach right away with the false cadences and sudden modality changes. The cello part is virtuosic in both works, and Queyras has impressive technique and fine phrasing and musicality. And the tone of his cello is really unique with a ghostly character, very different from the upfront modern cello tone. And that starkness comes out even more without the vibrato, as you mentioned. But I found it kind of appealing and unique. A really enjoyable album. It's very dynamic, and the sound quality is really good on this recording.
Yeah, that's right. It is. All right, moving on. I have mentioned before that 2024 is the 100th anniversary of Gabriel Faure's death. What better piece by him to talk about than his Requiem, his Mass for the Dead, a very famous piece that we've never talked about before on the podcast. And there's a new recording of it now. It's paired with Charles Gounod's Messe de Clovis, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. The soloists on this Faure Requiem are Emőke Baráth at soprano. She's in a lot of operas, performing a lot these days. And Philippe Estèphe, the baritone. The orchestra is Le Concerto Spirituel, conducted by Hervé Niquet. It's a pretty cool name, Hervé Niquet. It's on the Alpha label, and it was released on August 16th, so it's a month old. After 1870 in France, the spectacular settings of previous Requiem masses gave way to a more ethereal mood of recollection. Intimacy was expressed through a return to a simple purity, ideally embodied in the models of Gregorian chant and the Renaissance motet. This is the context in which Faure's Requiem and Gounod's Messe de Clovis appeared, only a few years apart. Tracks 1 through 7 are Gabriel Faure's very famous Requiem Opus 48. Now, this is the 1893 version. This work has become a musical symbol for French funeral monument. The work departs from the sequence of pieces from the ordinary and proper of the Requiem Mass that composers usually set to music. So there's no gradual, no Dies Irae, which is usually the central part of a Requiem, and no Benedictus. Faure also avoids the dramatic vein generally cultivated by his predecessors, giving the work instead a rather angelic atmosphere. And that's really what we love it for. Faure described the first performance of the work in 1888, this is when it was originally premiered, as being for an ordinary parishioner at La Madeleine, yet it seems significant that its composition immediately followed the death of both of Faure's parents. The 1888 version was incomplete as we know it today, and was followed in 1893 by a performance including all of the movements we know today, but in an orchestration excluding violins and woodwind, and that's the way we hear the work on this recording. This is the 1893 version. In 1900, Faure had a new version for full orchestra performed as well. Now, when Russ and I were children, that was the version that was always being recorded, but I personally like this 1893 version the best. It's more intimate in its sparer scoring. Track 1, Introit and Kyrie. This has a lush, gorgeous sound on this very intimate-sounding recording. The choir sounds very close to the mics, and a lot of detail is picked up. Let's start with the Kyrie section just after the introduction. I'm sorry, I said that was the Kyrie section. It is, in fact, the Requiem Aeternam section. The Kyrie is sung later to the same melody. There's an organ in there, and we hear it clearly along with the instrumental ensemble accompanying the choir. The words are clearly audible, and it's a real pleasure to hear such a good performance and recording of this work after so many years. The pacing and balance is excellent in this movement. In track 2, the Offertoire, polyphonic strings, again sounding highly resonant on the recording, are heard. The choir comes in a cappella with the same polyphonic lines. The pace is a bit quick here, but this only gives energy to the performance. Again, the text is clearly articulated and right up front on the recording. Philippe Estèphe, the baritone, gets his first baritone solo in the second minute. He gives the vocal line a bit more urgency than I usually hear. Usually this is sung in a calmer manner. It certainly made me sit up and take notice. Let's hear a sample of a little bit of that. The choir comes back for the last verse, bookending the movement's structure of choir, solo, choir. Track 3, Sanctus. Heavenly choral voices come in for the Sanctus, accompanied by arpeggiated strings and a solo violin that doesn't quite break through the texture, but rather blends with it. Again, the pacing is on the quick side, but it works well. There's a great clarity to the recording. The hosannas set to a marching rhythm at the end are powerfully sung. Track 4, Pie Jesu. The soprano Emőke Baráth sings this solo and takes it in a more operatic fashion than I'm used to. Again, at a quick tempo. I remember hearing past recordings where a boy soprano would sing this part. It was slow and sweet, and here the feeling is changed to something more on the dramatic side. It's appealing, though. Listeners familiar with prior recordings may have to make an adjustment here, but I'd say it's worth doing. Let's hear the beginning of the track. Track 5, Agnus Dei. I'm getting the feeling at this point that the work is going by rather quickly. There's a definite sense of direction to the performance. It doesn't linger on the beautiful timbres and has more of an urgency to it. It is, of course, lovely, with great detail on the recording. Here's a section I love. This is from the Agnus Dei, about the 2-minute mark. Great harmony from Faure there. The movement returns to the Requiem theme we heard at the very opening of the work on track 1. Track 6, Libera Me. This is a solo for baritone Philippe Estèphe. Let's hear him begin this movement. There's a French inflection to his Latin pronunciation, and I rather liked that. The choir comes in afterward and interweaves with the baritone. Track 7, the final movement, In Paradisum. The opening choir sounds vaguely like boys' voices, but it's the women's section of the choir, I'm pretty sure. The opening again is taken at a slightly faster tempo than I'm familiar with, but detail registers, especially in the heavenly organ line. Let's hear the beginning. I really can't get enough of this work. It's so beautiful. And it winds up coming across as very compact on this recording. Tracks 8 through 13 are a work by Charles Gounod that was unfamiliar to me, Messe de Clovis. This was started in 1891, and I believe Gounod died around 1893. This was published posthumously in 1896. The title page has the inscription, composed for the 14th centenary of the baptism of Clovis at Rheims, 25 December 496. All right. Clovis I was the first king of the Franks to unite all of the Franks under one ruler. And in fact, if you go to Paris, you'll see a lot of statues dedicated to him. Changes the form of leadership from a group of petty kings to rule by a single king, and ensuring that the kingship was passed down to his heirs. He is considered to have been the founder of the Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Frankish kingdom for the next 2 centuries. Clovis's baptism led to widespread conversion among the Franks and eventually to religious unification across what is now modern-day France, the Netherlands, and Germany. He is considered to be the first king of what would become France. The work is part of an overall attempt to rally Catholics to the support of the Third Republic, to which Pope Leo XIII had officially consented. The complete version of the score includes a prelude with grand organ and fanfares for trumpets and trombones, but the edition published by Choudin is for the more modest forces of a choir and choir organ. The remark on the title page that the work is in the style of Gregorian chant only indicates that Gounod took inspiration from the system rather than copying it. So the first movement is a Kyrie, and here the choir proclaims its confidence in the spirit of the victorious monarch Clovis with a resolute forte attack. The organ plays an introductory line, and we have gorgeous sound again. Let's hear the opening. The choir sings the Kyrie in a sort of scattered harmony where the Christe is more polyphonic, with entries for different voices at different times. The work has the same gentle feel as the Faure Requiem. The movement goes for less than 3 minutes and seems to end quickly. Great full organ sound, especially at the end. Track 9, the Gloria, invokes the spirit of traditional French Christmas carols. It sounds oddly celebratory, a style I don't generally expect to hear in a Gloria. I like the setting and the overall sound. Let's hear the opening. Text is sung in block harmony and the words are clearly audible, very helpful with this complicated text. The setting remains pretty simple throughout, with the text itself as the focal point. The setting is austere, just organ and choir. Track 10, the Credo. The Credo is also set sparely and simply, with the words declaimed by the choir in block harmony again, easy to follow, with accents from the organ. It goes by fast, and there's a catchiness to the phrasing in the Et in unum Dominum section, with each phrase ending on the same note. I want to sample that. It's pretty interesting. The prayer is rather long, and so is the setting, clocking in at about 8 minutes. The emotion of the text is illustrated in the music. It quietens with Christ's birth, grows dramatic with a crescendo to the crucifixion, and the resurrection builds to a bright harmony. The tone lightens for the Et in Spiritum Sanctum section, and the organ has the last word, playing some powerful chords at the end. Track 11, Sanctus. The organ quietly opens this movement. I like the setting of the 3 iterations of the word Sanctus. Let's hear that. The section is brief at only 1 minute and 12 seconds. Track 12, Benedictus. Distant, quiet organ opens the movement. The choir comes in softly on a lovely harmony. This has polyphonic entries for the voices and is brief at just over 2 minutes, gorgeous ending chords and melody. Track 13, the final movement, Agnus Dei. Here we get the fluty, breathy timbre from the organ at the opening, sounding solemn. The baritones begin the text. Let's sample the opening. Each section is separated by a pause, and in the last, the men's and women's voices begin in polyphony, but come together at the end for the Dona Nobis Pacem that ends the work. Track 14, we get 2 extra tracks, Louis Albert, O Salutaris. This is for soprano, violin, harp, organ, and choir. The work recalls the luxurious grandeur of the great galleried churches of Paris. The text has the soloist and choir adoring Jesus at the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. This starts with the organ, which accompanies the soprano for the first 2 lines. A violin comes in for the 52nd mark, and the soprano is Emőke Baráth again, and she sings this operatically. We hear the choir at 1 minute and 17 seconds, and the harp finally enters with arpeggiated chords at around 1 minute and 30 seconds. Let's get a sample where we can hear the entire ensemble. I'll start this at the 1 minute and 45 second mark. The final track is André Caplet's Adagio pour violon et orgue, so Adagio for violin and organ. This is track 15. It's an example of late 19th century instrumental meditations for violin or cello and organ, intended for use in services that were rather more elaborate than usual. Caplet rearranged this work as the 3rd movement of his Feuille d'album for flute and piano, where it has the title Invocation. The melody is interesting here, with the violin going for some unexpected melodic notes. It's a close, rich recording again. Let's sample the opening. Violin and organ are an interesting combination. Here the violin is given a lot of room ambience to have it sound like it's in a big church with the organ. It works well and provides a prayerful though sudden ending. The music just stops dead at the end when the melody reaches its last note. It brings the entire recording, in fact, to a prayerful though sudden ending. So the Faure Requiem is given a more dramatic reading here than it generally gets. It's usually performed with a pastel sort of softness, sounding more angelic. But here the sound has a bit more of an edge to it due to the closeness of the recording and the tempos used. They're all on the faster side. Fortissimi and brass sections come across powerfully and with dimensionality to the sound. It's a new interpretation of the work urgent in feeling, and going by very quickly, which I guess means I was compelled by it. I felt it was over way too fast, though. I rather like the old performances that linger on the beauty of sound in the score, and I feel like this performance lacks that last bit of spiritual uplift. But this performance is going for something different. It emphasizes more of the work's structure, and I think I'll be listening to it often to absorb Hervé Niquet and the Concert Spirituel's approach to the score. It's still very beautiful sounding. Gounod's Messe de Clovis also goes by rather quickly, but is much more austere in sound than the Faure Requiem. It sounds like it was specifically written for services to elevate the congregation and highlight the text. It's an enjoyable listen, especially in the vividly clear performance we get here. I found this performance to be uplifting, but I have to say it's the only recording I've ever heard of this work. The two final pieces are brief and enjoyable. To be honest, the entire album is paced rather quickly, but again, it works well. It's definitely an album I want to revisit for the clarity of the recording and freshness of the performances. But I have to say, for the Faure Requiem, I'd go for older recordings for more spiritual solace.
I only really have general observations on these because I wasn't listening to them critically at all. I was just trying to take in the overall arc of the piece. And the characters of these two main works are very different. I found the Faure to be serene and meditative, with a few moments of transcendence in the third and sixth movements. It sort of breaks towards the heavens a little bit.
Right.
Mostly it's rather austere.
I feel like this work has a lot of that in it, really.
Right. And I used the same adjective you did for the Gounod, uplifting. I found it generally more of music evoking sort of a positive theme of like already transcendence having been reached. And interestingly, it has more pauses, and there are sections where the organ really stands out in this work. So I noticed that a lot. And the other two short works, I found them pleasant, and the violin and organ was an interesting combination, like you said. So, yeah, it's kind of an overall meditative recording, but I enjoyed the moods created and tried to follow the spirit, comparing it to other masses and things that I've listened to. I have heard the Faure before. I'm not able to compare it with other performances like you say, but maybe worth listening to compare it as well.
Yeah, I haven't heard a new recording of the Faure Requiem in decades, probably. It's been a long time. Although there might have been one about 10 years ago, but the ones I've heard are actually pretty old. But I guess they just got inside me, so I guess I find them really reassuring. And I guess I'm always going to be comparing them to that. But I did like this one. I'm going to have to hear it again, absolutely.
Well, speaking of organs sticking out.
Yeah, here we go. We have another organ recording. This is by 4 composers, and one of them is one of my favorite composers, Christopher Rouse, an American composer. These are all organ concertos by Christopher Rouse, along with Wayne Oquin, Horatio Parker, and a work by Charles Ives. Paul Jacobs is the organist, and this is the Nashville Symphony, conducted by Giancarlo Guerrero, and we've heard them before in a previous Rouse recording on Naxos of his Fifth Symphony. It might have come out before the podcast started, but I don't remember. I'll have to look back in the records there. But this is on the Naxos label, and it's part of their American Classics series. It was released on August 23rd. All right, so the first work on this is by a composer by the name of Horatio Parker. Now, he's really famous for being Charles Ives' teacher, that Charles Ives didn't like very much. Anyway, this is his organ concerto in E-flat minor, Opus 55, composed 1901 to 1902. Parker was born in Auburndale, Massachusetts, and taught at Yale, where Charles Ives was a student in his first class in 1894. Ives considered him routine-minded. Yet the musicologist Gail Sherwood McGee claims it was under Parker's guidance that Ives acquired the tools to become an accomplished composer. Parker was devoted to education and essentially worked himself to a premature death at the age of 56. Oh, thankfully we didn't do that, huh? We might still, though. Who knows? Anyway, he died in Cedarhurst, which is on the south shore of Long Island in New York. The organ concerto was commissioned by the Boston Symphony, which requested a work in which the composer might appear as the soloist. The orchestra consists of brass, timpani, harp, and strings, but no woodwinds. That's kind of an odd omission, isn't it? No woodwinds.
Yeah.
Track 1, Allegro Moderato, moving to Andante. This is the first movement of a 3-movement work. This begins with a forceful chord. According to the notes, I didn't really think it was very forceful. I'll let you decide. From the king of instruments, the organ itself, over which the strings pronounce the dignified main theme. Let's get started and hear this opening. So it's an attractive opening. There's a second gentle theme expressing both solace and longing. And to be honest, that forceful chord is pretty quietly and subtly played here, I would say. Jacobs just sort of lays it down. The recording itself is very quiet, and volume has to be turned up considerably in order for the admittedly impressively detailed recording to impact. So if you're listening to this on a stereo, you could just turn the volume way up and you'll get the impact. It's all there. And you get a really beautiful sounding recording as well. There's a lot of richness and subtlety to the organ's tone that the engineer has captured admirably. The quieter theme begins at around the 1 minute and 23 second mark. The work itself is pretty straightforward, with imposing sections showing off the organ's power contrasted to more lyrical moments. It's in the romantic idiom. At the 4 minute and 2 second mark, the organ begins a chorale section solo. A lyrical violin comes in with a melody floating over it. The violin gets up into the sweet higher range and plays angelically. This is underlined by the slow harp arpeggios in the 5th minute, and then brass comes in to heighten the holy atmosphere of the section. The entire middle section is very calm. We get a build-up out of this section at 8 minutes and 30 seconds from the strings, culminating in a big organ chord at 9 minutes and a wash of Brucknerian strings following. The movement ends calmly, with that holy feeling conjured by the middle of the work. Track 2, Allegretto ma ben moderato, is scherzo-like in character. There's an appealingly playful dancing character to the organ at the opening. Let's hear a little bit of that. The strings come in and trade off with the organ, who keeps to his dancing figure throughout. The strings are given playful figures too, such as pizzicato in the rhythm. The organ also gets an opportunity to show off some of its timbral registers. They change often in the first minute. Eventually the strings and organ engage in echoing each other's themes, and the piece ends with them in alignment. Track 3, Allegro moderato molto risoluto. This is the third and final movement of the work. It features a fugue from the imposing opening theme, and it ends on a major chord. The opening theme is played by imposing brass after an equally imposing timpani roll. The organ gets a long solo section with its fugal theme echoed in faster lines in the high end. I'm going to sample this from around the 1 minute 25 second mark. Pretty uplifting. The organ really melds into the orchestration in this movement. It turns to church-like improvisations toward the end of the second minute, and there's some lovely orchestration at about the 4-minute and 30-second mark where a rippling harp arpeggio accompanies the organ chord, and the orchestra teams up with the organ to play the theme and set the organ up at 5 minutes and 2 seconds for a solo section building upward from the bass. Orchestra rejoins, and the work builds up to a powerful final chord. Track 4 is a contemporary composer, Wayne Oquin. Now, I'm guessing that it's a Spanish pronunciation. He's from Houston, Texas. And it's a Spanish name, but he may have Americanized it. I'm going to go with Oquin. Anyway, he was born in 1977, so he's a pretty young man, 10 years younger than us, or at least me. And this is a work called Resilience that was composed in 2015. Oquin was born in Houston, Texas. He now lives in New York City, and he teaches at the Juilliard School, where he has been since 2008. This work began when the conductor of the California-based Pacific Symphony, Carl St. Clair, asked Oquin to compose a piece for organ and orchestra that would have a celebratory character. The composer realized from the start that this would entail writing for two vast ensembles, each of which is rivaled only by the other in terms of both power and subtlety. Oquin describes the work as a 13-minute exploration of two seemingly limitless spheres. The work is based on a variety of call and response patterns between the soloist and orchestra. The title comes from the fact that the initial idea's influence is never abandoned throughout the piece, despite being transformed far from its original profile, so it's resilient. Oquin hopes that the theme's tenacity mirrors real-life tenacity, determination, and perseverance. So this is a work that's meant to inspire us to continue on. It's recorded at a louder volume than the previous piece, and was obviously recorded at a different date, though the location is the same. It's still in Laura Turner Concert Hall in the Schermerhorn Symphony Center in Nashville, Tennessee. It's got powerful percussive hits at the opening, with the organ playing a straight rhythm staccato line. There's some urgency from the orchestra. Let's hear the opening. There's some impressive use of the brass in there as well. I like the organ timbre at 1 minute and 17 seconds. It sounds spacey and electronic, so I'm going to give you a taste of that as well. The organ then moves to a thin but more organ-like texture, so Jacobs is again exploring the timbral possibilities of the instrument. They're a constant surprise in this work. There's a more urgent section with a pulsing bass, then a section in 4 minutes and 12 seconds driven by percussion that I rather enjoyed, though it's very brief. I'm going to sample that as well. Get a lot of bits of this very varied piece of music. Oquin has a lot of appealing ideas in this work. At 5 minutes and 40 seconds, a calmer section arrives with steady string chords and a fluty sound from the organ, playing lightly. In the 7th minute, the organ gets some space to itself and plays a questioning set of figures, trying to find its way. The strings come back and start a more solid theme and rhythm. It's fugal, eventually involving the whole orchestra. The organ picks it up with staccato chords. By the 10th minute, we've got massive chords on the organ saturating the space, complete with brass fanfares ringing out. This is certainly a celebratory section. There's a satisfying build-up to the final chord at the end, full of blazing sunshine from the organ and orchestra. I have to say, I really liked this work. Tracks 5 through 7 are Christopher Rouse's organ concerto. This was the last concerto that he completed in his lifetime. It was written in 2014, and Rouse died in 2019 at the age of about 69. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and died in Towson, Maryland, actually, in 2019. Paul Jacobs was the organ soloist at the first performance of this work. One of the satisfying qualities of this work is that Rouse leans on the lower ranges of the orchestral instruments he uses. The overall sound of the work has a darkness to it, which the organ soloist, along with violins and trumpets, alleviate. It's a 3-movement work. The first movement is Allegro non troppo, track 5. This starts right away with an aggressive, twisting Rousian line, followed by a rather complex organ solo. The virtuoso is never far away in a Rouse piece. Let's hear the opening. A lot of new key areas coming into play there. The orchestra explodes with wild figuration at around the 1-minute mark, and the organ responds wildly at first, but then calms the texture down. The movement continues with a mostly overly excitable feeling to the rhythm, calmed when it is by the organ when it gets some solo space. In the 4th minute, Rouse pulls out some new textures, some of it a growling sound from the orchestra. There's some fantastic brass writing in the 4th minute, fanfarish in nature, that the organ takes over momentarily before calming the music yet again. Big gestures from the orchestra lead to a winding, excitable organ line towards the end. Crashing percussion and orchestral lines bring us to the end, which peters out and leads directly to the middle movement, marked lento. This is track 6. This starts with a beautifully serene set of calming chords from the strings. Rouse was fantastic with orchestral timbres of this sort, and it's very appealing here. At the 44-second mark, the organ comes in, sounding much like the strings in tone and approach, and continues the strings idea in a slightly different direction. I actually find a lot of the string writing here touching, as in the gentle entry of the higher strings at 1 minute and 29 seconds. At 2 minutes and 35 seconds, the reedy lower ends of the orchestra play the main material, as the organ plays a 2-chord ostinato figure, which chiming percussion eventually pick up. The organ takes over with a solo line at 4 minutes and 15 seconds with a chord bed underneath. At 4 minutes and 50 seconds, the 2-note ostinato trudging figure is back in the bass as the strings build up. The organ takes over, still playing the ostinato in the bass pedals. Some awesome brass take on the ostinato and fill it out harmonically to a big climax at around the 6-minute mark. The movement is brought to its end by gently distant organ chords, with a wash of string chords filling it out at strategic points. Beautiful movement. An organ note is held to connect this movement to the last one. Track 7, a presto. The critic George Loomis likened this movement to a fiendish magic gigue. It starts with fugal figures in the strings, very excitable. The organ enters in the same rhythm at 25 seconds. There are some cool timbres in this movement, particularly from the brass. Let's hear some of the variety of sounds heard in this movement. pretty exciting stuff. The pounding bass drum is heard, encouraging the organ on, and then the strings interrupt briefly. The organ gets a lot of time to shine in this movement and does so in a sparkling bright tone, sounding a bit brassy. An ostinato bass toward the end of the second movement drives the strings forward, and percussion and organ briefly take this over. Some crashing percussion liven the movement further at 3 minutes and 45 seconds, and from here it gets fanfarish and a bit Hollywood sounding in its fullness and boldness. Let's hear a bit of that. The ending chords are full and loud. This is a very satisfying work. And then we get an encore, tracks 8 through 16, solo organ, Charles Ives' Variations on America, written 1891 to 1892, revised and edited by E. Power Biggs in 1949. All right, America. Today we know this tune as My Country, 'Tis of Thee. Ives wrote this work in his teenage years. It was premiered by Ives at a 4th of July concert in 1892 when Ives was 17 and probably would have been lost to history were it not for the efforts of E. Power Biggs, who wrote to Ives in 1948 requesting music to feature on his weekly radio broadcast from Harvard's Busch-Reisinger Museum. In his response, Ives stated that playing the highly demanding pedal variation, which is in the final Variation 5, gave him almost as much fun as playing baseball. The work may sound like satire, but it's most likely that Ives meant the work as a sincere exercise in variations for organ. So this is not mocking the tune at all. Track 8 is the introduction, Allegro. Jacobs takes this opening boldly, then changes the timbre for the second part of the opening line. We hear a bit of the theme at the end of the intro, and I'd rather play that than just the straightforward theme that we're going to hear in track 9. Let's hear this, and you'll be able to pull this melody out easily, especially if you're American. And I've let that go into track 9 just so you could hear the theme played in full. It's played straight as it would be played in a church. Track 10 is Variation 1, Moderato. The theme is in the left hand and pedals, and the right hand plays figuration in the high end. Track 11, Variation 2, Andante, has some added notes to the melody and lots of decoration. The timbre is the traditional organ sound. Track 12 is an interlude, Interlude 1. Both interludes are Ives' first notated use of bitonality. This interlude combines F major for the right hand and D flat major for the left hand, and pedals. Boy, does that sound like a real pain to perform. Jacobs chooses a more nasal timbre for what I guess is the D flat major part. It's pretty funny and stands out in contrast. Track 13, Variation 3, is an allegro. There's something circusy about the way this variation dances, and I'm going to sample this one. So let's give it a listen. Maybe it's more of a merry-go-round sound, but it sounds very fairgroundish. Track 14, Variation 4, Polonaise. The Polonaise has an almost military barracks type of feel here. It sounds a bit raucous. Track 15, Interlude 2, also bitonal, combines A-flat major and F major. It's very brief, almost tacked on as a finale to the previous variation. And track 16 is the final variation 5, Allegro. This is the pedal variation I spoke of earlier that Charles Ives said that he really enjoyed playing. The theme is very clear in this variation. The pedal part thunders out in the last minute, and I'm going to sample the very end of the work. And what a great send-off for the album. It turns out to be an entertaining work, especially in Paul Jacobs' hands. I come away from this recording with the idea that Paul Jacobs is absolutely the star. He grabs attention with his playing throughout the album, whether it's through his virtuosity or clever use of timbres to isolate or draw out certain parts. Both the Oquin and Rouse works make an immediately appealing impression in his hands, coupled with the perfectly balanced orchestral tones of the Nashville Symphony and Giancarlo Guerrero's conducting. I liked the Horatio Parker work enough, but on this program it seemed more like an introduction to the more exciting things to come, and it was recorded at a very quiet volume. The Ives piece has rarely had a better performance. I personally can't think of one. Jacobs knows how to entertain the ear. I loved the Rouse and Oquin compositions and felt Jacobs' playing showed all of these works in their best light.
Certainly a wide range of musical expression for the organ. The Parker I found to be quite pretty, with attractive melodies and a kind of call and response thing going on with the orchestral parts. The middle movement is gentle with varied strings in pizzicato and then flowing sections. And I liked the big brass and powerful organ finish of the third movement. The Oquin has fun brass fanfares and percussion, lots of active and exciting organ lines, and the Rouse is mysterious and sounds really difficult to play. The orchestration has interesting combinations of sounds, and I think that will need more listening to unpack for me to figure out everything that's going on there.
And that's what's so great about it, because I want to just go back to Christopher Rouse works again and again, and probably will anyway.
And the Ives is rather playful with the ideas around the America theme, and on this track, after that soft beginning to the recording, the organ sounds absolutely gigantic and overwhelming, which is really cool. And nice performances throughout by Jacobs.
Yeah, and again, that Ives piece was recorded on a different date than the Oquin and Rouse works, so I think the mic setup is probably different on all of these pieces.
Yeah, those variations will really bring the house down at the end.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure that's the intention.
On to the jazz half of the podcast, and we've got a lot of variety this episode, starting out with a piano trio. The recording is called The Bounding Line by pianist Greg Rattan. It's on Sunnyside Records. It came out September 6th. Greg Rattan is from Seattle, Washington, and in his youth he spent his summers at the Bud Shank Jazz Workshop, where he studied piano with Hal Galper and arranging with John Clayton. He won 2 scholarships to the Berklee School of Music and also the Kreilsheimer Scholarship at Cornish College of the Arts in Seattle. He relocated to Los Angeles in 1991 and attended the University of Southern California's Thornton School of Music as a Dean's Scholar, studying composition, piano, and film composition. Rayton was a finalist in the John Coltrane competition, and he was awarded the Harry Warren Prize for Film Scoring in 1995. He was also a finalist in the Great American Jazz Piano Competition and the 1996 Hennessy Cognac Jazz Search in New York. He's composed music for ABC News, CBS, and CNN, and he wrote the original score for the independent film Dumbarton Bridge, for which he won the grand prize for best score at the 1999 Providence, Rhode Island Film Festival. And in 2001, he formed Evergreen Point Music, a Los Angeles-based production company whose clientele includes NBC News, Sirius XM Radio, Warner Brothers, and various film and television projects. And he made his Jazz at Lincoln Center debut in October 2017. He's recorded 5 albums for Sunnyside Records. In 2019, he was awarded the Aaron Copland House Residency, which is important for this recording. About this recording, the notes say, the English poet and artist William Blake wrote of the intentionality and originality in art as being demarcated by a bounding line, meaning that the more sharp and distinct the boundaries of the piece are drawn, the more perfect the art. Pianist Greg Rayton took this idea to heart during an artist residency at composer Aaron Copland's home, Rock Hill, in Cortlandt Manor, New York, in the summer of 2019. Inspired by the seclusion, environment, and Copland's library, Rayton utilized his time at Rock Hill to create a blueprint for his new recording, The Bounding Line. The time spent at Rock Hill resulted in the sketches of the pieces that are heard on The Bounding Line. He's here with his trio, Greg Rayton on piano, Jack Darrow on bass, and Dean Koba on drums. They've been playing together for nearly 30 years since they met while studying at the University of Southern California. The recording is going to start out with an original composition by Rayton, The Path. The notes tell us it's a composition inspired by scenic pathways that connect the Hudson River parks that Rayton and his wife walked during the evenings of their stay in Cortlandt Manor. It's a waltz with an easy flow. It's a little hard to pick out the structure of the melody, but it sounds like it's 50 measures with a harmonic change that catches your ear in the 21st measure. Rayton's touch is light and springy. Let's have a listen to this recording get going. As he works into his improvisations, they get some really blazing lines as he goes along, and I'd like to play some of those for you as well. From there, Darrow gets a bass solo before they return to the melody once again. Track 2, My Love is an April Song. This was written by composer Earl Zindars for Bill Evans in the early 1960s. The song was recorded but not released until 1997. You can find it on the complete Bill Evans of Verve live at the Trident Club 1964. Maybe you heard that version. Here, it's in the same ballad character. Rattan starts it out solo, and your ear is drawn to his voicings of the harmony. I'd also like to check out some of Darrow's gentle bass solo on this tune. Rattan is back with a final section that somehow manages to be both sparse and lush at the same time. Track 3, Summer Days. The notes tell us, while at Copeland House, Rattan spent many hours behind the picturesque large windows in the music room where the joyful Summer Days was born. Rattan starts this one out solo too. It has a straight beat with even quarter note chords marking out the time. Around the 11th measure, there's a 2-beat measure that breaks up the flow. Bass and drums join in, building it up. To a climax with speedy improvised lines from Rattan before a placid ending section. Let's hear a little bit more of his improvisations on this tune. Track 4 is the title track, The Bounding Line, a Rayton original. A tricky, syncopated and jumpy 36-measure melody. It goes around twice before Rayton launches into breakneck, speedy solo lines. Whoa, things are off to the races there, and I know you'll want to hear some more of this dazzling solo, so let's pop back in and hear some more. From there, they'll go around that melody shape. You hear those notes that are familiar by now, but this time, Koba will get to work up some drum energy before a final time through to close it out. Track 5, Dave Brubeck's Rising Sun, which was inspired by his view from his Tokyo hotel window. This was released on his Jazz Impressions of Japan in 1964. I have this one in my CD collection, and this tune has really interesting harmonies. We'll miss Paul Desmond's airy alto, but Rayton does a fine job with chord voicings, capturing the Brubeck essence before putting his own more flowing style in his improvisations. Here I'll give you a sample in the middle of this tune, and don't miss Koba's fine brushwork underneath as well. Darrow has a bass solo that rings out on this track as well. Track 6, back to a Rayton original starting point. The notes say it contains a descending chromatic harmonic structure that is an endless loop, creating a falling sensation. Rayton plays the sequence once, and Darrow's bass reinforces the descending motion when he comes in. Sometimes all you need is a simple short pattern as a starting point for lots of ideas to spring from. I'm reminded of the Czech pianist Emil Viklitsky, who can take 8 measures and turn it into a tune of endless creative ideas. Anyway, let's listen to how this gets going. And let's check out some of Dara's ideas on his solo on this tune as well. From Reitan to finish this one up. It's a short tune at just 3 minutes and 18 seconds. Track 7, Keith Jarrett's Love Number 1. This is from 1967's Life Between the Exit Signs, Jarrett's first recording as a trio leader. It's pretty with rich harmonies. Let's check out Reitan's solo piano opening. Bass and drums are in from there. Reitan shows off a light touch and connected lines on his improvisations, and Dara has a melodic bass solo with interesting rhythmic lines as well. Track 8, Greg Reitan's Rock Hill, taking its name from the Copeland House. The melody has a 25-measure structure that flows smoothly but has interesting harmonic diversions. I had the image of like moving around rocky outcroppings on a hill as the navigation goes on. See if you hear what I mean. So he goes around the idea twice before moving into fluid improvisations. His lines are really flowing with energy, so let's listen to a little bit more. Just bursting with ideas there, pushing things ahead. Darro has a bass solo too before Rattan finishes it up with another melody round. And the recording ends up with Aaron Copland's Down a Country Lane. The album notes tell us that this was the first piece that Copland wrote when he moved into Rock Hill. It was originally composed for a commission from Life magazine, and the piece here is read verbatim, apart from Darro doubling some notes on his bass and Koba adding color via his drums. I found that it has a clock-like quality to the rhythm, and the piano bass note movement is also interesting. Let's hear the start of this. Well, that's about half of it. It's a short piece at just 2 minutes to wrap up the recording. This is a lovely recording. Rattan's original melodies are often ethereal, and your ears are drawn as much to his harmonic ideas and chord voicings as the melody lines in his compositions. The program is unique, also including pieces from Dave Brubeck, Bill Evans, and Keith Jarrett done in reverent but individual fashion. And of course the final piece is pure Copland, the composer who inspired the recording itself in many ways. Rattan's playing style combines a sense of space with blazingly fast improvised lines that are extremely smooth in execution. The trio's synergy and communication are of a high level, and Darro and Koba match the concept here perfectly. Darro's solos are thoughtful, and Koba's drumming has a lot of nuance and texture. There's a lot of subtlety and finesse in all of the performances.
I thought that Greg Rattan has that rare gift of being able to come up with attractive ideas for his solos, and he shapes those solos in an appealing way too, so that those ideas stand out. He has a warm approach, getting the most out of the harmonics produced by his chords. I liked his kind of big sound in most of the tracks. He uses the whole keyboard palette for his solos, and particularly in the high end where he gets some really appealing sounds. And there were some really pleasing turns of phrase, for example, coming out of the quick solo in the bounding line. Dean Koba is mostly gentle and subtle on drums, but when he gets his chance to solo on the bounding line, he's really hard-hitting, and I really sort of enjoyed hearing those two sides of him. Bass solos by Jack Darrow were appealing too, often soothing the more aggressive piano lines that they follow. All in all, this album left me feeling calmed by the end, but I wouldn't call the tracks themselves calming. It's just that the overall, feeling of it, kind of left me in a good place. So I really enjoyed the piano playing, especially on this.
Not being much of a pianist myself, but I would say he's a pianist's pianist. If you're a piano player, I think you'll find his technique and style very admirable.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I was really attracted to it myself. So,
all right, next album. Get out your seatbelt and your thinking cap. You're going to need them both here. For Micah Thomas's Mountains on Artwork Records. This came out September 13th. Micah Thomas was born in 1997 in Columbus, Ohio, and he started playing songs on the piano by ear at the age of 2. And shortly after that, he started private piano training. In 2015, he received the Jerome L. Green Fellowship from the Juilliard School and received his Master of Music degree in 2020. He's been touring as a leader of his own trio and also as a member of the Emanuel Wilkins Quartet and a sideman for a lot of other big-name musicians. In June 2020, he released his first album, Tide. We've heard him a few times on the podcast, going back to episode 50, that was called First Anniversary Renaissance Men. Mike, that was with Emanuel Wilkins on his recording The Seventh Hand. We heard him in episode 84, Cerebral Keys. That was his piano solo album from 2022. And 2023, he released Reveal, a trio recording. But here, this is something new and larger, so I wanted to check it out. And we just heard him a few weeks ago in episode 178, Trumpet Divertimento. That was playing along with trumpeter Noah Halpern on his recording, The Embrace Volume 1. So the recording notes tell us about this recording. Mountains is the result of a 2022 residency commissioned by New York City's The Jazz Gallery. This album was recorded live over 4 sets of performances that took place on June 16 and 17, 2023. Thomas indicates, quote, with Mountains, I wanted to create a collection that delivers a cathartic, massive experience for both performers and the audience. It's about capturing the incredible familial feeling and overflow of spirit that only a large group of musicians can create. I intentionally wrote in the moment, letting each section lead me to the next. This method allowed me to capture the natural movement of the human imagination and heart. Keep all that in mind as we get to the music here. On this recording, Micah Thomas piano and all the compositions, Adam O'Farrell on trumpet, Emanuel Wilkins alto sax, Nicole Glover tenor sax, Caleb Smith on trombone, Kanoa Mendenhall on bass, and Kweku Sumbri on drums. The notes also say that Mountains is divided into 4 main sections. I think I have the basic idea here. I'm not sure about the last section. And interestingly, the titles of the tracks, main section ones are capitalized, and the other ones have lowercase letters. But the first section is called Life, and that's the first track here as well. The notes say, inspired by imaginative flights through terrain, this track offers a complex musical journey that mirrors the diversity of organic structures.
Complex is the right word here.
And things start out with the longest track on the recording. The pulse but indistinct meter of the rhythm section matches the character of the flowing horn lines that overlap, sometimes in unison, sometimes in harmony, and sometimes with a horn veering off in a new solo direction. The horn arrangement continues for about 2 minutes, and Thomas solos first. His playing is mercurial, with one idea instantly leading to the next. Let's take a listen to the beginning of his solo. It's a rather long solo which he brings to a rhythmic conclusion, and a new longer section of horn lines makes up the middle section of the song, with a lot of interaction with Thomas's piano. And then Glover has a tenor sax solo with a free searching quality, digging in toward the end in the lower register and then getting some high cries toward the end. This is really her big moment on the recording, so while we're here, let's check out some of her playing. There are more horn lines, and then Thomas works up a rhythmic vamp with drums and bass to decorate with some more improvised ideas, with the pulse disappearing before the end. Now the next main section is processing, and the next track is also processing with a capital P. The description says a dramatic narrative that reflects the episodic and non-linear nature of grief. This has a loping bass walk and Mingus-like jarring horn outbursts. I found it quite interesting. Let's take a listen. It continues on in similar fashion to a sudden ending, being the shortest track on the recording at just under 2 minutes. Track 3 is Lament. Caleb Smith starts this out with a longing trombone tone over Thomas's piano. Let's hear the beginning of it. Things get a little more jarring with bigger interval jumps, and then they turn placid after Smith's trombone seems to be finished, and Thomas's piano becomes more of like a soft lullaby of piano chords midway through the tune, then into some more agitated ideas from Thomas. I'm assuming this is part of the non-linear nature of grief narrative, which sort of shows maybe rapidly changing emotions or feelings towards something. Track 4 is Libre. This is a solo piano start, and then the rest of the band comes in, taking us to what seems like New Orleans and back in time for a bit. Let's hear that. Do not adjust your equipment. We're sort of left here wondering what's happened, with silence and some mysterious cries and lines from individual horns and occasional piano, bass, and drum interjections. There's more silence than sound as it goes on, and that continues to the end. Track 5 is No Answer. The horns start this out on their own, keeping that New Orleans rhythmic feel, but transported into a new dimension. At about 2.5 minutes in, it's time for the rhythm section to come in and make things festive. Let's hear a little bit from about 2.5 minutes into the tune. A sort of processional feel develops in spots as it goes along from there, and suddenly Wilkins breaks out into a solo that starts with sounds like the strangulation of some waterfowl, but works into speedy, intense lines over drums and bass. I know you want to hear that. I'll give you a little taste, including some of that goosiness. All right. The ending section has soft piano and subdued horns, creating a kind of delirious atmosphere. All right, the next section's Hide and the Mountain. It says these tracks explore intense personal emotions and the metaphorical long journey through wilderness. So track 6 is Hide. A change to something delicate and more vulnerable here, starting with Wilkins's alto sparse piano and the other horns coming in with subtle backing. It continues on with just sax and piano from there, and then the ending is quite lovely, so let's have a listen to the end of this track as well. All right, a bass note and drums come in at the end to connect it to the next track, which is The Mountain. And the rhythm section sounds like a detective movie from the 70s as a backing track with a pulsing bass rhythm. The horn lines add an air of mystery. Let's just check it out. Continues on in the same fashion with trumpet and sax trading improvised phrases. Somebody gets an extended drum solo while keeping the same rhythmic beat and subdivisions going. A climax at the end leads to the next track, which is Nomad. This has a loping bass and lazy horn lines. After about a minute, there are hints of bluesiness and interesting wavers in the sax notes. horns get improvisations among their horn lines, and Thomas adds some more bluesy touches on piano. Before 6 minutes, it returns to what I called the detective theme idea from the previous track. And track 9 is Collapse. This has horn cacophony and angry piano percussive chords that work to an impending sense of danger. The ending is particularly dangerous with kind of neat trombone calls. So let's check out the ending section of this tune. Okay, the press release says the fourth section is called Divine, inspired by Alice Coltrane's orchestral music and the concept of finding something uniquely divine through artistic creation. That doesn't correspond to the track names, so the next track 10 is Encounter with a capital letter. Something different here with closely arranged horn lines flowing in sync with the piano. Let's take a listen to that. It becomes a little more chilled out over a weepy bowed bass solo from Mendenhall that really cries out. And then there's about 30 seconds of silence before the horns return legato with the opening part again to a sudden ending. Track 11 is Through. Just the horns start this out. It's kind of mysterious and works into a strange oscillation. It goes forward with more interesting sounds appearing and then explodes in cacophony when the rhythm section enters for the last 40 seconds. And the recording ends up with track 12, Coda. This has a repeating motif in the horns that starts by itself and then gets a busy, percolating rhythm section underneath it for a lot of contrast to what's going on in the horns. continues on with the rhythm section softening towards the end, but with final drum hits. And that's the recording. It's a trek into the mountains for sure. There's a lot of different musical scenery explored. You'll need to trust Thomas as your Sherpa to get you safely through the mountain passes on this one. This is a recording that needs your attention from start to finish to appreciate. There are some delicate spots and also areas of danger. It would have been interesting to have seen the performances live. It's certainly a unique exploration of Thomas's ideas expressed through a larger ensemble than we've heard him with, and I found his ideas for the horns interesting. Each musician gets moments to express themselves, and Thomas has a lot of solo moments too that show he's never short of complex creative ideas in any situation.
I like that image of artist as Sherpa, guiding you through these mountains, yeah? All right, well, I like the way that in the ensemble playing, the complicated theme, everything was complicated on this record. There was really nothing terribly straightforward, or if it was, it didn't last a long time. The complicated theme found its way to brief moments of older style themes, like we pulled out the New Orleans bit and then the detective theme and things like that. And then just as quickly they disappear just when you figure they sound familiar. Oh, I recognize this, and then it's just gone. In fact, multiple styles are heard in single tracks. Sometimes they just peek in momentarily. Mm-hmm. And it's an entertaining listen for this reason, or at least for the first half of the album. Track 3, Lament, starts out with spacious playing and jagged piano accompaniment, and then changes to something almost like Brahms in the piano chords in the second minute. And in track 4, the style goes for some odd atonal polyphony to circusy New Orleans jazz, to virtual silence, with odd sounds sometimes breaking that silence. Or how about track 5, where we hear New Orleans jazz that breaks into a tango for a few bars before going off into a Berlin cabaret direction. Very creative ideas, impressive arrangements, as well as a lot of independent cacophony. It's as though all of the jazz and quite a bit of popular and art music history from around the world have been squeezed into a single album. The ensemble seems to break up into cacophony more and more as the album goes on, and I guess this narrative ends in a kind of chaos. There's quite a bit of intellect in the approach, so this isn't one to lay back and relax to. It was interesting to hear all these familiar names playing on an album like this, so I'm glad I heard it. But I have to tell you, you know how those records used to have that like parental advisory sticker on them when we were kids? I feel like we need to put a relationship breakup advisory sticker on this record. Don't listen to this when your spouse is home and in a bad mood, because your relationship might end.
Mike has many of these recordings in his collection, which is why he's remained successfully single.
I'm speaking from experience. I actually had a Japanese girlfriend at one time who once played this piece of music that was sort of cacophonous, and she just very, quietly listened to it. And then when it was over, she just turned to me and said, "Can we listen to some normal music now?"
All right, I've got you covered there. We've got some normal music, and this one's going to go down, I don't know, how would I describe this? It's kind of buttery, butterscotchy, and caramel. It's going to be
nice.
All warm and soothing, with a bunch of players who we've heard many times on the podcast. And this is from one of our favorite labels, Posi-Tone, trombonist Ryan Keberle's Bright Moments. It came out on September 13th. We've got an octet here. We've heard Ryan Keberle several times on the podcast. Back in episode 56, Latin Spring and Swing, we heard his Sonhos de Asquina on alternate side records. That was with his Collective do Brasil. And in episode 124, Mexican Skull and Latin Bones, we heard his Considerando, also on alternate side records. That was from 2023. On this recording, he's joined by lots of names that we're familiar with from Posi-Tone label, and also the great Alex Norris on trumpet and flugelhorn. We've got Michael Deese on baritone saxophone, Patrick Cornelius on alto and soprano saxes, bass clarinet, and alto flute, Diego Rivera on tenor sax and flute on one track, Art Hirahara on piano, Boris Kozlov on bass, Rudy Royston on drums, and of course Ryan Keberle on trombone. As always on Posi-Tone, the producer is Mark Free, recording engineer, mixing engineer, mastering engineer Nick O'Toole. And all of the compositions on this recording are Ryan Keberle's originals with fabulous arrangements of these wonderful horn players. The recording starts out with Quintessence, Great stuff right from the start with an awesome groove from Kozlov and Royston. The horn arrangement is exciting on the 16-measure intro. You can hear Deese's big bari sax over in the left channel. The tune builds up in 16-measure sections, starting out with a trumpet lead from Norris. The next section gets sax added, and then the saxes get lead, and Keberle soars to the front for a section on trombone. There's a lot going on that continues, but let's take a listen to the first minute of the tune anyway. Arrangement builds for a minute and a half and then falls quiet, but with Kozlov's bass still throbbing for Keberle's solo to come out. Ideas with snappy rhythms, fabulous solo. Rivera follows with a smooth solo that really builds up, and Keberle's back with soaring melody lines that stick out from the final building horn arrangement, and all the horns get some improvising simultaneously before a chilled ending with just the rhythm section. Track 2 is Stillness Within, a rhythmic alternating chord pattern intro with light touches from Royston. Cornelius gets the first section on alto with nice vibrato, and the other horns stack in to bring Keberle in on a line. Continues to build, and it resets with Hirahara's rhythmic riff, and the horns have some haunting improvised interplay. Hirahara has a rhythmic solo with tight fills from Royston that gets flowing horn backing, and Keberle bursts out into a really singing trombone solo. It resets once more with Hirahara's piano riff after some trickles into the opening melody idea and horn arrangement once again. Track 3 is All Ears. This has an interesting trudging pace started out by Hirahara's half-note chords on the introduction. Cornelius starts out the melody on bass clarinet here, handing off to Norris's trumpet as the horns build in. The rhythm gets heavier and the harmonic landscape thickens with a new section, including flute and low trombone notes from Keberle. That leads to a section with Rivera on flute in the right channel and Cornelius on alto flute in the left. It's kind of magical, and I'd like you to hear it. It gets back to the opening melody, building up from the bass clarinet again. The heavier section returns also, with Keberle soloing on top with high and low lines to the end. It's a really great arrangement. Track 4 is Sisters of Mine. Cornelius is featured on the melody on soprano sax here, and Norris takes over. Both of them have great tone, and the melody on this tune reminds me of I Love You, Porgy. Let's check it out. Keberle and Rivera have some sexy line exchanges, with Rivera continuing on for a subtle solo. There's a melody arrangement of Cornelius' soprano and Keberle together that is really rich. Let's listen to a little bit of that. Soprano sax and trombone sounding great together. And Keberle gets to finish the tune with some bluesy lines over bowed bass from Kozlov. Track 5, To Be and Not to Do. Kind of Zen-like title there. Just the horns start this out with a thick arrangement. Deese kicks it into tempo with a bari sax line. Let's hear this one get going. rhythmic section follows that works to Keberly launching into a solo. There's some really cool bass and piano lines that work under the next arrangement section into a kick-up of the rhythm for a piano solo from Hirahara. It's quite exciting, so let's check out a little bit of his playing. Royston really beating up some excitement under Hirahara there, and there's a final short section that ends the tune. Track 6, Edu. This one has a lot of rhythmic change-ups with a complex arrangement. It's constantly evolving, and it'll be hard to get a sample of what's going on in a short minute. Here I'd like to just play Norris's flugelhorn solo that has such a cool harmonic sense and great lines. Track 7 is Despite the Dream. Great horn arranging to start this one out as well. I love hearing the bass clarinet in there. It moves along slowly with Dees getting some improvised lines underneath. Then it works into a samba feel with little solo lines for the horns, and Cornelius gets an alto solo feature that we should check out on this one as well. Dis follows with a bari sax solo, and an interweaving arrangement of horns takes it to the end with a long hanging trombone note. Track 8, Make America Again. Hirahara starts it out, and the horns stack in from the bottom. Building up there to a bass solo from Boris Kozlov. Let's hear a little bit of that as well. Comes in really soaring from there. It's a short tune at just a bit over 3 minutes, but really gorgeous. Track 9, Fooled and Pushed Apart. Royston gets to start this one out on the drums, joined by Hirahara and Kozlov into a building horn arrangement. Let's hear it. Cornelius gets an alto solo over a samba-type beat section with hard hits from Royston. While we're on this one, let's check out a bari sax solo from Michael Deese. And the recording's going to end up with track 10, When I'm Away. Rising piano figures with bass chimes from Kozlov get this started into smooth sax melody from Rivera, muted trumpet from Norris, and Keberly taking over after that. And let's hear one more solo from Keberly emerging from the end of that arrangement. Goes on and on, with the horns coming in for backing, Norris's trumpet reaching way up high on this one, and Keberly carries the tune right to the end. We've heard all of these players many times on the podcast, but this is a really special recording. Keberly's trombone playing just keeps getting better and better with every release we hear him on. Great tone and real authority in his playing. His compositions are wide-reaching, with pleasing melodies, different rhythmic landscapes, and harmonic moods. But what really makes this special is the arrangements. Bass clarinet and bari sax, flutes, and Norris rounding out the brass with Keberly's trombone. There are so many layers here. You want to listen to this one again and again. And of course, all of these players are great soloists. I just highlighted some of the solos. Be sure to enjoy this one from start to finish.
On this album, it was really the structure of the compositions that kept my focus. This record took its 8-member band and combined them in interesting ways during what would normally be space for soloing. There's a bit of soloing, but often we'll get rhythmic changes as band members step out for brief lines, they hand off to each other, or they combine for intriguing takes on the thematic material. It was a really creative approach, and it kept me guessing. All the playing is expert, as we'd expect from an all-star ensemble like this, and all of the tones are very clean-edged and sharp. It's an enjoyable listen with a lot of surprises.
Yeah, really great stuff, as we've come to expect from Posi-Tone.
Kind of unique, I thought, in this case. Yeah. It was really a little different than we normally hear.
Got a lot of variety in both the classical and jazz sections, as usual, this week, and we've got things lined up for next week. So what's on next week's classical menu, Mike?
So I've been looking at the new releases, and there's nothing really big in classical music, but there's a lot of odd, kind of offbeat stuff, and I was kind of interested in that. This first one isn't offbeat. It's called An Evening in Vienna, 1784, on the Superphone label. And it sort of imagines an evening of string quartet playing of music from the period, and that would include Haydn, Mozart, and some other composers as well. We're also going to hear the Estonian cello. Now, Estonian in this case meaning Estonian composers from the 20th century, so it's really before the really famous 21st century composers like Arvo Pärt. He's really a late 20th century composer too. And people like him, we're going back to the Edward Tubin and Heino Eller days for that one. And then we were talking about this earlier. There's a Marius Nesset album, Who We Are. He's really a jazz artist, but he's done this with the pianist Leif Ove Ansnes. So it's a classical pianist and a jazz sax player getting together for really what's going to be a chamber music themed album. That's pretty interesting. So I don't know what it's going to sound like, but it's going to be a little bit of crossover maybe.
Yeah, because I saw that one appear on some jazz lists too. Yeah. So it could be a nice bridge between the two parts of the program.
Yeah.
On the jazz side, I've got some new Greek jazz, which we haven't heard in a while, so I'm excited about that, from bassist
I'm always up for that.
Tinos Manos with his recording North Wind on Puzzle Music. We'll check that out. We've got an old favorite, vibraphonist Simone Moulier's Elements of Light on Candid Records, and trumpeter David Weiss with his sextet Auteur on Origin Records. Both those last two just came out September 20th, so they're fresh off the presses. If you want to get started listening to those recordings as we do, they'll be up on a playlist on Deezer a few hours after this episode is published. You can also get a link to it from our Facebook page. Before we sign off, as always, we want to thank Fast Signs of Staten Island for our glowing neon logo. Any final words for this episode, Mike?
Well, sorry to see the summer go, but looking forward to the autumn nights of listening to music.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been episode 182 of Adult Music, and we'll be back next week with 183. So until then, keep listening, and we'll see you again next time.